Good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Helms, and I have been excited to be able to do this class this morning in the, Fathers of the Faith, church history, basically. And I have the opportunity this morning to talk about one of my favorite authors. Our church history figure this week is perhaps not one that many of us would consider a typical subject for a class on church history. C.S. Lewis. However, I was quite excited when Ross asked me to teach this because I've been a long-standing fan of C.S. Lewis since my college days. And I graduated from college 50 years ago. Today, C.S. Lewis seems to be better known for his Christian fantasy writings, especially the Screwtape Letters, and, of course, the children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia. But I first knew of him when I read Mere Christianity and Miracles, and then followed those with Surprised by Joy. I still consider Mere Christianity one of the clearest and most readable apologetic works by a layman that I've ever encountered. Does anyone know how the material for Mere Christianity first came about? Daniel, exactly. Yes, during the time of the war, and he was asked to give these talks about Christianity, and they were broadcast on the BBC and then put into a book form. And he did this over quite a long period of time. Miracles came along after the war in 1947. Miracles is a very closely reasoned defense of the idea of a supernatural world that's behind and above the natural world that we see and experience. And then Surprised by Joy, mistakenly considered by some to simply be an autobiography, but in fact it's an attempt by Lewis to follow the rather roundabout path that brought him to a reluctant acceptance of the truth of the Christian faith. Let's see here. I can get my act together. So by that time, after reading those books, I was hooked. And I read everything by Lewis that I could get my hands on. This was a time before there was such a thing as Amazon Books and Wikipedia and online public libraries. So I had to hang around in a Christian bookstore in Charlottesville, Virginia, with hopes of finding a collection of Lewis's essays that I hadn't read yet, or some new biography. So today, Lewis is widely appreciated, both for his fiction and his nonfiction, for his fantasies, and for his common sense defense of the gospel. But today he also has critics in the church. And we'll take a look at why this may be as we learn more about him this morning. And we'll consider C.S. Lewis's place in church history. Lewis was Clive Staples Lewis, the C.S. Clive Staples. How would you like to have a name like Clive? He was born in Belfast, Ireland, November 29th, 1898. Now, when Lewis was 4, their family pet dog, Jaxie, was killed when a passing, this was in the days when they were horse-drawn carriages, ran over the dog, and Clive was devastated, and he insisted on his family from that point on calling him the dog's name, Jaxie. Jaxie, the name of the dog, and Lewis insisted that they call him Jaxie, which they did for a while and eventually dropped the ending and called him Jack. And he was Jack for the rest of his life to his family and friends. He and his older brother, Warnie, and the older brother with the bike is Warren, and Jack were just best friends growing up. They enjoyed drawing. They enjoyed writing stories. This is when Lewis started writing about talking animals, a land that he called Animal Land. And then, and Warnie was interested in India and called his imaginary world India. Now, Lewis's world was set in the past. Warnie's world was modeled after modern day India, and it had steamships and horseless carriages. And eventually they combined their worlds into one entity that they called Boxen. And they had maps of where Animal Land was and where India was in their imagination. Now, one day, while Lewis had stayed inside to write more stories, Warnie brought him, this is a British term, a cookie tin, the little metal cookie box with a lid. And he had taken the lid and filled it with moss and twigs and pebbles and laid out to be a small garden. And Jack was enchanted. I wish I had a picture of that cookie tin lid with the garden set up in it. This was Jack's first experience of beauty, and it affected him years later with a hard to describe longing for joy. In the German, it's called Sehnsucht, and it's a deep, bittersweet longing. And it's the kind of longing in which the longing itself is the desired experience, not the thing you thought that it pointed to. It wasn't the tin with the garden in it. That's not what he wanted, but it gave him that sense of longing. He experienced it again later with other things in his life. He experienced it as he learned about Norse mythology. He experienced it with the operatic Ring trilogy by Wagner. And even later, he experienced it in the writings of men like George MacDonald and J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien talked about something he called God's myth. The idea of a myth about a God who dies and comes back to life, which is common in various mythologies, but with the difference that this myth really happened. And this is the joy that Lewis refers to in his book, Surprised by Joy. Lewis lost his mother to cancer when he was only 9. And as you can imagine, this unsettling event, combined with his early school experiences in Ireland and then in England, brought Lewis to lose what faith he had started with. This secularization, if you want, was reinforced by several of his teachers and tutors, particularly this man, William T. Kirkpatrick. He was an extremely logical atheist. And he taught Lewis how to think clearly and how to express his ideas rationally and forcefully. Kirkpatrick challenged Lewis from the beginning of their time together when he first arrived to live with the Kirkpatricks during his tutoring. And Lewis said later, after being knocked down sufficiently often, I began to know a few guards and blows and to put on intellectual muscle. And he remained friends with Kirkpatrick for years. But by the age of 17, Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves, who shared his love of Norse mythology, and he said, "I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention." And then Lewis, this was when he was 17. Lewis arrived at Oxford in 1916 at the age of 17 and won a scholarship. But the very next year, as you can imagine what was going on at the time, he entered the British Army and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in World War I. And he entered the British Army as a second lieutenant, and he arrived on the front lines in northern France on his 19th birthday. He hated the war, but he enjoyed and liked the camaraderie with the other soldiers. After just a few months, he was injured by shrapnel, and during his recovery, he read a collection of essays by G.K. Chesterton, a writer that Lewis liked and enjoyed for what he called his goodness. Chesterton also happened to be a Christian. And Lewis says, after reading that and later reflecting on it, he says, "A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading." During his early years at Oxford, Lewis moved through various philosophies from materialism to rationalism, then to romanticism. And somewhere around that stage, he happened to pick up a copy of Phantastes, a book by George MacDonald, in a railway bookshop. And as he began reading, he encountered something that he later came to know as holiness. And he said that his imagination was, in a sense, baptized. As he put it in Surprised by Joy, "I had not the faintest notion of what I had let myself in for by buying Phantastes." And then Lewis's spiritual journey was further influenced by several friends he made along the way. I mentioned Arthur Greaves, who shared his love of Norse mythology. Lewis often called the Norse myth, often called it northernness. That was his sense of expressing the unusual nature of what he found there. And then when he arrived at Oxford as a student, and then became a fellow, and then finally a professor, or a don in the British university terms, many of his colleagues that he most enjoyed talking with, and of course arguing with, were Christians. Men like Owen Barfield. These are all academics, men who were professors or tutors, fellows in the English department at Oxford. Owen Barfield they were very close friends for a long time. And of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, a man named Hugo Dyson, and Neville Coghill. And these were all men who were involved in his group of friends called the Inklings. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But while he was at Oxford, Lewis continued his journey through various philosophies popular at the time: realism, idealism, the concept of an impersonal absolute mind. Think of that in capital letters, absolute mind, which conveniently didn't make demands on you. But God had other ideas. In Lewis's words, "Then I read Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and for the first time I saw the whole Christian outline of history laid out in a form that seemed to me to make sense. somehow I contrived not to be too badly shaken. And then finally, at the age of 30, 1929, Lewis faced facts. He said, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen," was the name of the college at Oxford that where he lived and worked. He says, "I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." Now that was just a belief in God, not a belief in Christ yet. It was only a short step, though, from theism, the belief in God, to Christianity. 2 years after that experience, he had a challenging discussion with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, two of those men I just showed you. They were walking along this famous walk in Oxford, Addison's Walk. It's the River Cherwell that flows through Oxford, and where you see the punters. They're like big canoes that you would move along the lake like a gondola with a big pole. And they had a challenging talk about Christianity one evening as they were walking along there. And then just a week after that, Lewis and his brother Warnie, Lewis was riding in the sidecar on a motorcycle that Warnie was driving on their way to Whipsnade Zoo. I had never heard of Whipsnade Zoo. It turns out it's the largest zoo in the United Kingdom. Who knew? But he later wrote, "When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. When we reached the zoo, I did." And Lewis then realized that the joy he had desired so strongly in his youth was not an end in itself, but it was a pointer to something beyond his own experience, or rather to someone beyond his own experience. Following his conversion, he began meeting regularly with several of his Christian friends at Oxford, primarily to read and to talk about one another's writings. And this group was known as the Inklings. They included Owen Barfield and J.R.R. Tolkien and quite a number of outstanding scholars. This group met for about 20 years. Sometimes, I think Thursday evenings, they met in C.S. Lewis's rooms at Magdalen. But Tuesday mornings, they met at the Eagle and Child, a pub in Oxford. It's also known as, they would call it the Bird and Baby instead of the Eagle and Child. Sometimes they just called it the Bird. These weekly meetings on Tuesday mornings particularly became so well known that in a detective novel that was written at the time by Edward Crispin called Swan Song, his detective in the novel is sitting with a group of other people in front of a roaring fire in the Eagle and Child. And the detective suddenly says, "Oh, there goes C.S. Lewis. It must be Tuesday." That account I find fascinating, partly because of the fact that Edward Crispin would himself have known about this habit of the Inklings meeting, and that C.S. Lewis was their leader, but that he would expect his readers of a detective novel to know about C.S. Lewis's habits. Lewis is well known for his books on theology and apologetics. And sometimes it's easy to forget that he actually made his living as a literary critic and historian. He wrote several widely acclaimed literary works, including A Preface to Paradise Lost by John Milton. That's Milton's epic poem about the fall of man. That's where we get the quote, "It's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." That's the kind of thing you run across in Milton. Well, Lewis was an expert on Milton. He could quote long passages from Paradise Lost. And so he wrote this preface to Paradise Lost, but it's a book in itself. Then he wrote The Allegory of Love, not to be confused with the book he later wrote called The Four Loves. The Allegory of Love is a scholarly exploration of courtly love in the literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And then he wrote one of the volumes of the Oxford History of English Literature. This is like an encyclopedia, multi-volume set, and he wrote the entire volume, volume 3, Poetry and Prose in the 16th century. I have a copy of it at home if anyone would like to read it. Now, Lewis's lectures at Oxford were very popular. It was said that he was the biggest draw that the English school had at Oxford in the 1930s. Unfortunately, this is not an actual picture of C.S. Lewis. This is a C.S. Lewis portrayer, Dr. Kevin Radiker, who's a professor of English at Anderson University in Indiana. But students appreciated that Lewis's lectures were meaty and clearly presented with no time wasted. Walter Hooper, Lewis's biographer, says, Lewis would lecture for precisely 3/4 of an hour, and he never waited to answer questions. 2 minutes before the end of the lecture, he would quietly gather his notes together and return the watch, which at one time he was in the habit of borrowing from one of the nearest members of the audience, and he would prepare to leave, lecturing the entire time. And then as he finished his last sentence, he would step off the dais and stride down the hall at full speed. If he was at all late in arriving at the lecture, he would begin lecturing even before he entered the hall. Several times his great voice would come booming up from the steps outside the hall door, and then Lewis would enter in haste, lecturing vigorously. But today we know Lewis better as the author of many books and essays of interest to the Christian, books on Christian theology and apologetics, as well as several works of fiction with Christian themes. The first of these was an allegorical account of his conversion to Christianity, which Lewis modeled roughly on John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. But he called his version, which was a return to his Christian roots, he called it The Pilgrim's Regress. It was published in 1933 at the age of 34. The pilgrim in the book is named John, and he experiments with a series of philosophies, much as Lewis himself had done, before eventually retracing his steps to his original Christian upbringing. Now, the book had mixed reviews and didn't sell real well, and Lewis later realized that perhaps he'd made a mistake thinking that anyone else had come to Christ in the same way that he had. However, The Pilgrim's Regress does introduce readers to Lewis's formidable mind. One hallmark of Lewis's writing is the necessity to read and reread in order to understand even just the shortest passages in his books. And one example of his writing, a character in the book named Reason, I said this was an allegory. Reason tells John, there is no excess of goodness. You cannot go too far in the right direction. And later, he says, "What does not satisfy when we find it was not the thing we were desiring." Now, Lewis's next work of fiction came after reading David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus, a work of science fiction, which convinced him that other planets in fiction were useful for depicting spiritual adventures. As a result, Lewis wrote 3 works of science fiction known as the Space Trilogy. And the books follow the travels of Dr. Elwin Ransom. Interesting name, Ransom. It's not an accident. He was an Oxford philologist. Anyone know what a philologist is? Study of language. Someone who studies language, and particularly the history of languages. And I found that in British terms, it often is referring to someone who was studying classical literature, from Greek and Latin all the way through. So it wasn't just a focus on English literature. So Ransom travels through space, and I don't think it's very clear exactly how this capsule that they traveled in was powered in order to reach other planets, but it happened. It seemed to be some sort of anti-gravity type device. But he traveled first to Mars in Out of the Silent Planet, and then to Venus in Perelandra, both times finding himself in opposition to another man, Dr. Weston, a scientist who had the goal of perpetuating the human race throughout the solar system. Now, the first 2 books were fairly well received, but the third book, That Hideous Strength, was much longer. I've got my copies of it. That Hideous Strength is like twice. I don't know if you remember the books of J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter books. They got progressively longer as they went along. Well, Hideous Strength was very long and very complicated. And it even brought in the character of Merlin from Arthurian legend. This was probably a result of Lewis's friend at the time, Charles Williams, who himself wrote fantasy Christian. He was a Christian and wrote these very unusual. I've got 3 of his books at home, and I find them very hard to read. And many of his readers found That Hideous Strength difficult to get through. And it certainly never achieved the popularity of the Chronicles of Narnia that came later. Some of the inhabitants of Malacandra, or Mars, in Out of the Silent Planet, are rather simple folk who relish the simple pleasures of life. And one of Ransom's new friends on the planet says, "A pleasure is only full grown when it is remembered." And interesting, I think that's a point of view that Tolkien's hobbits would probably take. Simple pleasures in life and taking time to remember them. Perelandra on Venus, the second volume, readers encounter creatures called Eldilla. That's the plural. Eldilla, a plural form of Eldil, who were celestial beings of goodness, whose powers, kind of like angels on earth, are terrifying to humans. And one friend of Ransom, who met an Eldil on earth, tries to describe his impression to others. "I felt sure," he says, "that the creature was what we call good. But I wasn't sure whether I liked goodness so much as I had supposed." This is a very terrible experience. As long as what you were afraid of is something evil, you may still hope that the good will come to your rescue. But suppose you struggle through to the good and find that it is also dreadful. How if food itself turns out to be the very thing you can't eat. And home, the very place you can't live. And your very comforter, the person who makes you uncomfortable. Then indeed, there is no rescue possible. The last card has been played. Ransom's self-discovery continues in Perelandra, and Lewis challenges us with the idea that obedience to God doesn't mean losing our free will. It does mean being freed from internal struggles and finally able to live joyfully and righteously as God intended. Quoting from the book, you might say, if you liked, that the power of choice had been simply set aside, an inflexible destiny substituted for it. On the other hand, you might say that he had been delivered from the rhetoric of his passions and had emerged into unassailable freedom. Ransom could not, for the life of him, see any difference between these two statements. Predestination and freedom were apparently identical. He could no longer see any meaning in the many arguments he had heard on this subject. And if you were reading this book for the first time, that's an example of Lewis's prose that you would want to reread, probably several times. In 1940, Lewis published The Problem of Pain, his first real work of Christian apologetics, responding to the atheist's question of why there is evil and pain in the world. The common assumption is that God cannot be both good and all-powerful if there is evil in the world and pain. And Lewis rose to the challenge, writing a defense of Christianity, not for the scholar, but for the layman. And appropriately, it was ignored by scholars, but did very well in bookstores. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis writes, in a sense, Christianity, creates rather than solves the problem of pain. For pain would be no problem unless, side by side with our daily experience of the painful world, we had received what we think a good assurance that ultimate reality is righteousness and loving. Lewis argues that pain entered the world as a result of man's sin, but it serves an important purpose in the world. Pain forces us to recognize our mortality and our need for God. He writes, we regard God as an airman regards his parachute. It's there for emergencies, but he hopes he doesn't have to use it. And he also wrote, we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists on being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Pain's also used by God to mold us into the image of Christ and to remind us that this is neither our original nor our final home, that God has designed us to be his beloved children. Lewis writes, we are, not metaphorically, but in very truth, a divine work of art, something that God is making, and therefore something with which he will not be satisfied until it has a certain character. And here again, Lewis says, we come up against what I have called the intolerable compliment. Over a sketch made idly to amuse a child, an artist may not take much trouble. He may be content to let it go, even though it's not exactly as he meant it to be. But over the great picture of his life, the work which he loves, though in a different fashion, as intensely as a man loves a woman or a mother a child, over that work he will take endless trouble and would doubtless thereby give endless trouble to the picture, as if it were sentient. One can imagine a sentient picture after being rubbed and scraped and recommenced for the 10th time, wishing that it were only a thumbnail sketch whose making was over in a minute. In the same way, it is natural for us to wish that God had designed for us a less glorious and less arduous destiny. But then we are wishing not for more love, but for less. The year 1942, during the Second World War, saw the publication of a collection of articles that Lewis wrote beginning in 1941 for The Guardian, a weekly newspaper of the Church of England. The letters were written from a retired devil, Screwtape, to his young pupil, Wormwood, who was tempting his first human. Eventually, Lewis wrote 31 letters, which were published the next year as the Screwtape letters and dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien. The book was an immediate bestseller and still popular today because of the wisdom hidden in its lines. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. And indeed, Screwtape says, indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. And then in the meantime, as a result of the popularity of The Problem of Pain, Lewis was asked to give a series of talks on the BBC about the basics of Christianity. These were first published under the name Broadcast Talks, and then later enlarged by adding further talks, and eventually published under the name Mere Christianity. Anyone know where the term Mere Christianity comes from? Lewis borrowed it from Richard Baxter, a 17th century Puritan pastor. Mere Christianity set the tone for much of Lewis's Christian writings. He focused on what he saw as the essentials of the faith, not on denominational distinctives. As he says in the preface to the book, the reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. One of the most famous arguments Lewis makes in Mere Christianity is for the deity of Christ. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something. Lewis continued to explain the difficult truths of Christianity, turning next to the problem of miracles. In miracles, Lewis argues that it's not supernaturalism that is contradictory, but naturalism. And as always, he challenges believers and non-believers alike. He says, miracles are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. The central miracle asserted by Christians is the incarnation. They say that God became man. Every other miracle prepares for this, or exhibits this, or results. Then he says, An impersonal God, well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads, better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap, best of all. But God Himself, alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, king, husband, that is quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who have been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back, supposing we really found Him. We never meant it to come to this. Worse still, supposing He found us. Now, by this time, Lewis had become very popular with the American public. And as a result, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine in September 8, 1947, with a lengthy article which was full of biographical errors and rumors about his private life. And finally, Lewis began his first volume of the Chronicles of Narnia. His publisher was not enthusiastic about it, but because Lewis had a name that sold books, it was decided to risk it. However, they waited until he had the first 3 of the books written before they began publishing the first one in 1950, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Reviews were cautious, voicing concerns that the book would not appeal to modern children because it was too simple and also too scary. However, sales of the book skyrocketed, and subsequent volumes were published each year after that, usually right before Christmas. I won't take you through the entire series of 7 books because I imagine that many of you are as familiar with them as I am, but I'm happy to talk with anyone who's interested. Besides his many books, Lewis also wrote a number of essays. They appeared many of them appeared in a book called God in the Dock. But my favorite of Lewis's essays is not found in God in the Dock and is not technically an essay. Its title is The Weight of Glory, and it's actually a sermon that Lewis gave in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin on June 8, 1941 in Oxford. One of my favorite passages from it. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be daily laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it. And the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature that if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else, a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. And it's in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another. All friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. We're actually coming to the end of our time. Lewis had always carried on an extensive correspondence, and he eventually began corresponding with an American woman named Joy Davidman Gresham, a writer with 2 children and a husband who resented her writing. And she and Lewis appreciated her sense of humor and her writing, and they exchanged letters for months. She visited England, and to make a long story short, she, while staying near them in Oxford, she found that her permit to stay in England was not going to be renewed. She and Jack ended up getting married in a civil ceremony purely for her to be able to remain in England. But then she developed cancer. And as she needed more care, she and Jack actually got married in a church ceremony, and she moved into their home where they could care for her. She had a partial recovery. They were able to make a couple of trips, one trip to Ireland, another trip to Greece. And then eventually she died. Lewis kept a journal of what he went through during that time, and that, there's Joey Davidman Gresham and Lewis. And A Grief Observed is the publishing of Lewis's journal of his thoughts. It's very, very hard to read, not at all like his other books. He was able to publish one more book as he was getting sick himself from kidney disease and heart problems. And he passed away on November 22nd, 1963. His death, notices of his death were somewhat muted. Anyone else know what happened on November 22nd, 1963? Bill? John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley, but John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. So in my early Christian life, I developed a very deep appreciation for Lewis's thoughtful and clear expression of the essential and unashamedly supernatural truths of Christianity. But does he deserve a place in church history with some of the other names that have been discussed during this Sunday school series? Well, as I've grown in my understanding of Christian theology, I've seen that Lewis is weak in several areas. The most glaring problem I've come to see is a lack of biblical foundation for his reasoning. He's much more like St. Thomas Aquinas in his defense of Christianity based on rational thinking and logic rather than on Scripture. And Lewis leans more toward an Arminian, non-reformed view of salvation, more emphasis on man's free will, perhaps, than on God's sovereignty. And then Lewis also seems to take a view of salvation that suggests the possibility of being saved without explicit faith, or even through other religions. Some of the examples I have of that kind of thinking I will pass over. But to be fair, Lewis never claimed to be a theologian. His apologetic works were written as a layman for laymen. And his views on some of the issues I've listed are not clearly stated in his theological writings, but have been assumed from some of his fiction, which are not, and these works of fiction are not specifically theological in nature or intent. But Lewis is rightly criticized for some of his problems in his theology. But by the same token, he has also been used by God to bring many people to consider Christianity who might never have been open to it without Lewis's input and insight. Believers also benefit from his thoughtful and intellectually challenging writing, gaining a deeper understanding of God's goodness and love. So I find his approach through logic and reason, while not based specifically on Scripture, it's not incompatible with Scripture. All truth is God's truth, as Augustine would argue. So as I close this summary of Lewis's life and writings, I hope I've convinced you that C.S. Lewis deserves a place among the great Christian thinkers and writers in the history of the church. Thanks. No time for questions, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to talk with anybody afterwards. I know everybody's getting up. Can I just say a quick prayer as we finish up? Father, thank you for giving us great Christian men and women throughout history who have had an impact on the Christian church over the centuries. Thank you for this opportunity to share about C.S. Lewis and his impact, his writings. But we thank you most of all that all of these great thinkers have been pointing to one thing. They've been pointing to Christ. And that is what we measure greatness by how much they make us turn to Christ in our need. And we ask and pray these things in Christ's name now. Amen.